Military support or further provocation. Both Germany and the United States have confirmed that they will begin sending tanks to Ukraine to help in the battle against Russia. It comes 11 months after President Putin began his invasion, or as he called it, his special operation in Ukraine. These are the Leopard 2 tanks that will soon arrive on Ukrainian soil, courtesy of Germany. Meanwhile, the United States have committed to send 31 of their Abrams tanks. Russia says the decision is extremely dangerous and takes the conflict to a new level. For some, it's a step too far. Others would argue it's what's needed to add further pressure on Vladimir Putin. Well, tonight on our special programme, we'll be discussing whether sending more weapons to Ukraine could help bring about an end to the war, or if the opposite could happen. We'll also be answering your questions with a panel of experts and hear from the President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, who was speaking exclusively to Sky News when he was told that Germany would be sending him tanks. But first, these are some of the key moments of the day.
We will also deliver battle tanks to Ukraine, Leopard 2 tanks. That is the result of very close and intense discussions with our partners, with our allies. We will train Ukrainian troops here. We will make logistics available, maintenance, and we will also allow partner countries to deliver these tanks.
Last week, I announced that we would gift many battle tanks as part of the next major package of UK support to Ukraine, and I'm pleased that our friends and allies are preparing to follow our lead.
Russia is planning for new offensives. They are building heavily up. They have mobilized hundreds of thousands of new troops, ramping up production, acquiring ammunition from authoritarian regimes like Iran, North Korea, and therefore we have to be prepared for new Russian offensives. That's exactly why the announcements made last week are so important, with more armor, more ammunition, more also long-range weapons like the HIMARS, but also the new announcements of battle tanks. So it's urgent, and that's the reason why I welcome those important announcements.
Today I'm announcing that the United States will be sending 31 Abrams tanks to Ukraine, the equivalent of 1 Ukrainian battalion. Secretary Austin has recommended this step because it will enhance the Ukraine's capacity to defend its territory and achieve its strategic objectives. The Abrams tanks are the most capable tanks in the world. They're also extremely complex to operate and maintain. So we're also giving Ukraine the parts and equipment necessary to effectively sustain these tanks on the battlefield. And we'll begin to train the Ukrainian troops on these issues of sustainment, logistics, and maintenance as soon as possible.
Well, after these announcements, let me take you through which countries are now supplying Ukraine with tanks. And Chancellor Scholz of Germany said his government has approved the delivery of those Leopard 2 tanks to Ukraine, which is the first step to providing 14 of them from Germany's military stocks. The United States has announced that pledge to supply 31 of its Abrams tanks initially. And the UK, you'll remember, was the first country to provide tanks to Ukraine, offering 14 Challenger 2 tanks. The Netherlands, Finland and Spain have also announced their willingness to provide tanks to Ukraine, but haven't announced how many. Well, Ukraine has, of course, reacted positively to NATO allies providing further military support. And Sky's Kay Burley was actually interviewing President Volodymyr Zelensky at the moment that he found out that more German tanks were on the way.
Leopard 2 tanks are coming from Europe. You must be relieved.
Ще ні. Щойно. Шольц? Тільки що? У мене з Шольцем буде розмова. Ось зараз прес-секретар сказав, що щойно Шольц, канцлер Шольц, підтвердив, що дасть леопарди. У мене зустріч одразу з ним розмова по телефону одразу після нашого інтерв'ю. Я дуже радий, хочу подякувати Німеччині. Я дякую Британії і дякую Сполученим Штатам Америки за те, що вони прийняли такі рішення. Але я вдячний в цілому світу за підтримку України. Але якщо ми говоримо відкрито з вами і чесно, то кількість танків і термін, коли вони можуть до нас доїхати, мають невід'ємну, а важливу роль.
The carcasses of Russian tanks litter this square, but reports suggest that Putin is regrouping for a new offensive this spring. Join me for an exclusive interview with President Zelensky here in Kyiv on Sky News.
Well, the White House's National Security Advisor John Kirby tells Sky News that Ukraine would receive all the support it needs along with the tanks.
It's going to be many months before these tanks are actually delivered to Ukraine, but we're not going to waste time. We're going to get some training going for Ukrainian tanker soldiers here just as soon as we can. I mean, the Pentagon's working on those plans right now. And we're also going to help the Ukrainians build in the kind of logistics and supply chain needs that they're going to require to be able to field these tanks. They're the most sophisticated tanks in the world. There is a supply chain unique system that has to be provided to keep them running, to keep them operational. We're going to use the time available to us to make sure that the Ukrainians are ready to receive them so that when they get on the ground, the Ukrainians can go. We saw a terrific announcement by Germany, a significant announcement today that they are going to be providing and working with allies to provide 2 Ukrainian tank battalions to the country. So these Leopard tanks that the Germans have, they are there on the continent. They are more available. They are certainly going to be very effective inside Ukrainian lines, and they'll be able to flesh those contributions out sooner than the Abrams will be able to arrive.
Russia has responded to the announcements with our correspondent Diana Magne in Moscow and from our correspondent Siobhan Robbins in Berlin. But first to Mark Stone, who's in Washington for us. And Mark, it all seems to be happening now very quickly. And in terms of the sequencing, was the German announcement the key to unlocking the US decision?
Well, it's a chicken and egg one, and it's very hard to ascertain precisely the sequence of events. You say that the announcements are happening quickly, yes, but the delivery of the tanks, the American ones and indeed the European ones, well, that will take quite some time. I've been speaking to John Kirby, who you heard from just then. It's clear from him that the American tanks will take months and months to come, and that is largely because these tanks are not being delivered from existing US Army stocks, but they are being procured, perhaps from the manufacturers themselves or even from other countries to whom the Americans have sold these tanks. There is a suggestion they may be bought back and then provided to the Ukrainians. A very long process in terms of the American tanks. The American assessment on how long it will take to get the European tanks, the Leopards, either German or owned by other countries, well, the Americans say again that will take some time, months, not weeks. So yes, the decision making has changed very swiftly. It was only just a few days ago that the Americans were saying, no, we won't send our own tanks, the Europeans should provide theirs. Now, intense diplomacy, that's how it's the phrase that's being used here. Intense diplomacy has unlocked something. I think one way of looking at it is that the Americans have done just a little bit more than a statement of intent. They have said, yes, we will deliver tanks. But when you drill a bit deeper, it's clear that those tanks will not be coming for quite some time. Almost certainly not by the time this so-called spring offensive, the Russian spring offensive, is launched. But the hope, of course, is that the European ones, they will come. There are all sorts of issues, all sorts of logistical supply chain issues that are wrapped up in the decision-making being made here in Washington about the M1 Abrams. Also in the White House, they discussed the issue of letting sophisticated technology inside those Abrams tanks being given to the Russians if the tanks were to fall behind enemy lines. The M1 Abrams has depleted uranium armor, which makes it very, very thick, impenetrable. But that armor they do not want in the hands of the Russians. So an awful lot of logistical issues, but also diplomatic issues that are being ironed out. But don't expect to see American tanks on the battlefield anytime soon.
Mark, many thanks. Well, to Berlin and Siobhan Robbins. And Siobhan, everyone there must be aware and has been agonising about the symbolism of German tanks being used to fight Russians in Ukraine.
Yes, there was applause in the Parliament today when Olaf Scholz talked about the announcement, and there's been a lot of pressure from the opposition to make some sort of step towards sending Leopard 2 tanks to Ukraine. And internationally, outside Russia, many of the allies have been very supportive of this move. But as you say, this is a much more difficult issue domestically. And when people ask why has there been such a delay, I think we need to look at several main points. So one of them clearly was this fear that by sending Leopard 2 tanks, this could lead to some sort of escalation in the war. We heard from the Chancellor today saying that he didn't want Germany to be drawn into a wider war. And that was clearly in his thinking when he delayed to decide, was this really in the interest of Germany? Was this in the interest of NATO? The other thing that sources have been telling me was playing on his mind was this idea that they did want some sort of commitment from America. They wanted the firepower, the military might of the US behind them and a commitment to send Abrams, even if they're going to take a while. We know those Leopard 2s are going to take around 3 months. But the other big problem was political and public opinion. And I was talking to people on the streets of Berlin today, and it's really interesting because really the reaction to this is mixed. One person said to me, we have to help Ukraine, we can't leave them on their own. But then another lady said to me, I'm really scared this is going to draw us into a wider war. I have a 24-year-old son. I don't want him to be called to fight as a soldier. And then finally, one man said to me a view which you were just talking about there. He said, we know what happened when we fought with Russia in World War II. This is going to escalate. He was worried that the next step could be nuclear war. So there are real fears here. And I think it's important not to underestimate how big a step this has been for Germany. If you look back 11 months, no one would have foreseen that the Chancellor would have committed to these sorts of heavy weapons going to Ukraine. And you have to remember, these are the first German battle tanks that will be sent to fight on a European battlefield since World War II.
OK, thank you very much indeed, Siobhan. Well, to Moscow and Diana Magne there. And Diana, as we know, a furious response from the Kremlin talking about how this can alter the war. Any idea what the response will be in terms of on the battlefield?
Well, I mean, I wouldn't describe the Kremlin's response as furious because they've been asked about these tanks for quite a few days, even weeks now, given the fact that Europe and especially Germany were deliberating about this deployment. And essentially, their response has been firmly within the narrative of how they've talked about every weapons delivery to date, and that is that this is that reinforces the narrative that this is a NATO attack on Russia, where Ukraine is a proxy battleground, and every set of weapons is just more grist for that mill. Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesman, said today that any new delivery of tanks would be burn up just like any other. I think what will be disappointing for the Kremlin now is that they can't point to the dithering in Europe as an example of cracks or fractures in the NATO alliance. NATO has once again proven itself with these announcements to be remarkably robust and united, and I think that will be a disappointment for the Kremlin. How it reacts on the battlefield remains to be seen. We have been talking a lot about a possible Russian spring offensive, but I think the other side of that is, of course, that the Ukrainians need to be planning how to recapture those territories that Russia now claims as their own. They're in this war of attrition around Bakhmut at the moment. Where are they going to use those tanks when they finally arrive in the theatre, on the battlefield, to maximum effect, to try and punch through Russian lines? Will that be down around Zaporizhia to try and make some headway there, possibly towards Crimea, or will they continue to use them around Bakhmut? How much reserve force do either of these two sides have at this stage for a spring offensive? But I think, you know, we may see some sort of response from Vladimir Putin. He didn't say anything today. I'm sure Dmitry Peskov will be asked about it tomorrow. The German embassy, the Russian embassy in Berlin has issued a very robust response pointing to Germany's World War II responsibility towards Russia. I think that it feeds into Russia's narrative, but it's overblown. If you think about the fact that when the Nazis were pushing at the Red Army during World War II, with millions of Soviet lives lost. A lot of those lives lost were actually Ukrainian lives. Now, Germany, a very different entity from Nazi Germany, is supporting Ukraine against Russia to try and maintain its sovereignty and territorial integrity. And actually, when you look at it, that's a very, very different thing. So there's some symbolic idea that I think Russia will keep hampering on about, that you have German tanks rolling towards Russian lines again. Actually, when you look at the sort of nitty-gritty of that, it doesn't really hold much water.
Agne in Moscow, Siobhan Robbins in Berlin and Mark Stone in Washington. Thank you all very much. Well, now, as Siobhan Robbins was saying there, it took Germany quite some time to come to the decision to send Ukraine tanks. The chair of German Parliament's Defence Committee tells Sky News that the country's history was part of the reason.
I think for many people in Germany, it's now, for 1 year ago, it's a strange situation that we deliver weapons. It's always a topic in Germany. It's not very popular to talk about these questions. And so step by step, we started delivering weapons to the Ukraine. Besides help in economic way and also in a humanitarian way, we delivered many weapons, very effectful. We started in May. And I visited the Ukraine 2 times. That is really effectful, but tanks, it's always a special thing. And so the Chancellor was waiting to do it together with other countries. The thing is that Germany has to allow it. We have 14 countries in Europe and they use the Leopard battle tank. So Germany has to say, yes, you could deliver it. And so sometimes it needs time. But at the end, it was, I think, really a good sign. And I know I have now many friends in Ukraine, and I know they are really happy that Germany said, OK, we will do it together. And now also the United States will deliver, and Great Britain. I think it's a very important sign for Vladimir Putin that he realized that we are not only... Yes, that we do something.
The view from the German Parliament. So then a busy day of announcements. But how does Ukraine plan to actually use the tanks it will receive eventually? Well, retired Air Vice Marshal Sean Bell has been taking a closer look for us.
Tanks will be crucial for any planned Ukrainian spring offensive. Modern tanks such as Leopard 2 and the US Abrams have high-tech armour to improve survivability and a very powerful cannon, which can be fired accurately, on the move, day or night, and with a variety of different ammunition. President Zelensky has asked for 300 modern tanks. Although the M1 Abrams tanks is very capable, this risks playing to the Kremlin rhetoric that this war is a battle between the East and the West, between Russia and US-led NATO. As a result, the US was almost certainly keen to see the Leopard 2 deployed first. Despite historical and constitutional concerns, now that Germany has agreed to send Leopard 2s to Ukraine, numerous other countries are likely to also throw their weight behind Zelensky's request. Although at this stage the total falls well short of the 300 tanks requested, we might expect to see the totals rise over the coming days. But translating a commitment into fielded military capability takes time, and transporting these 65-ton tanks, together with their spares, ammunition and support equipment halfway around the world, will take weeks. However, training the Ukrainians to operate these modern tanks could take months. If Ukraine was able to liberate experienced tank experts, this training could be achieved more swiftly, particularly exploiting the West's high-tech simulators. We might expect Ukraine to focus these valuable assets on their primary offensive efforts. So although they could be used in the Donbass, around Bakhmut, or further north on the P-66 Russian resupply lines, we should expect them to be the tip of the sword of any Ukrainian attack on the land bridge between Crimea and the Donbass. In response, Russia has announced that it plans to field its own modern tank, the T-14 Armata, to counter this threat. But in reality, the T-14 has not yet been used in battle, is available in very limited numbers, and is reported to be very unreliable. Little wonder, then, that Russia has ramped up its threatening rhetoric over recent days, as they recognise the decisive role that Western tanks might play in this war.
Well, it has been an eventful day. As you know, we've got a panel of guests here to answer your questions on how the decision to send tanks to Ukraine could affect the war. Joining me this evening from Strasbourg, Ukrainian MP Elena Kamenko, who sits on Ukraine's Security, Defence and Intelligence Committee, Hamish de Breton-Gordon, and fresh from his efforts with our big screen, our military analyst, retired Air Vice Marshal Sean Bell. Very good evening to you all. Now, as I say, we've been getting an awful lot of questions sent in by Sky News viewers on this, a hugely significant moment in this conflict. So let's get into some of these questions and see if we can shed any light on them. And Elena, I'd like you to start for us and also give us your reaction, the Ukrainian reaction to these announcements. I know long called for, and you want more tanks to follow and indeed other equipment. But the question is this the moment the war changes for Ukraine and NATO?
Dear friends, first I would like to thank you for for providing tanks, and especially to the United Kingdom, because United Kingdom is an icebreaker towards today. And answering your question, if this may change the course of the war, I would say that technically, Western tanks are outperforming Russian tanks on the performance and battle management systems. Yeah. However, the number is still a problem. To radically change direction from defensive to offensive, our military need much more, triple or quadruple number of modern tanks. But still, today there is major breakthrough. So we are grateful for this, and we do not need only tanks. Me and my colleagues are hardly working on the supply of fighter airplanes. We hear quite often that supply of F-16 medium fighters, which present in European countries in sufficient numbers, but we have to emphasize that we're fighting against a technologically developed enemy, and to counterbalance the application of heavy Su-35 airplanes, we need F-15E fighters with large combat radius and ability to act as missile interceptor. So the existential need and further upscaling of the anti-missile defense system to protect against ballistic missiles.
OK, well, I know that my other two guests want to come in on that broad point, but we've got an awful lot of questions and you can address those points as we go through them. And they are often this specific to the very general, but here's a specific one. And Sean Bell, you touched on this in your earlier presentation, but just underline for us, the question is, how powerful are these Leopard 2 tanks in comparison to Russian ones? And it's not just about power, it's about armour as well, isn't it?
It is, and I've got to be careful. Hamish is a tanky, but if a direct comparison, most of the Russian T-62, T-64, T-72 tanks, which the Ukrainians are also using, are a 60s vintage. They've been around for a long time, and they're bulletproof, but they're no match for modern weapons. And that's been witnessed, that there are literally thousands now lying littered over the battlefields that have been destroyed during the tank battles. Modern tanks, even though Leopard 2, Challenger 2 and Abrahams are 30 to 40 years old, the amount of armour has increased significantly, which makes them much more survivable. But the key thing is the power of the punch. It's the power of that gun. And Challenger 2 is a really good example where the gyro-stabilised, it can be on the run over rough terrain, still fire very accurate rounds, a long distance, day or night, with a whole selection of different ammunition. And that's the game changer in this theatre of operation.
And don't worry, I've got plenty of questions about tanks for Hamish as well. And indeed, on that, and can I add in there, a lot of people also asking, and how quickly will they actually get there? And how quickly can the crews be trained up?
I think there's a lot of confusion about this. When I spent many thousands of hours on a Challenger 1 and Challenger 2, my conversion to Challenger 2 took less than a day. You know, these aren't complex like aircraft. So I'm sure when Marshall changed aircraft, it probably took, many weeks to convert. So I don't think we need to overcomplicate it. If these tank crews that are going to be trained on Leopard 2 and Challenger 2 are already trained on the T-72 or whatever, it shouldn't take them too long. These are not too complex. The fire control systems are sort of 90s PlayStation technology. You've got 3 or 4 buttons that you need to press in the right configuration to fire the gun. Driving a tank is driving a tank. Keeping them fit and on the road. A lot of this is plug and play stuff, which is well within the compass of the Ukrainians. So I don't think we should overestimate the ability to get these things on the road. They travel on trains, and we know the network in Poland and Ukraine is excellent. So I'm sure if they're available and the crews can be trained, we can get them up to speed. And we've seen how effective the Ukraine military are at fighting. There's not very much I can tell a Ukrainian tank battalion commander on how he should best fight his battalion. I'm sure he could do that. And if we can give him the wherewithal, and these tanks, Challenger 2 and Leopard 2, vastly overmatch the tanks they're up against. Probably a Challenger 2 will take 5 or 6 direct hits from a T-72 and still keep going. T-72 will take 1 hit from a Challenger and a Leopard, and that's it. And talk from Russia about Western tanks brewing up, it's just not going to happen. So I think this is a game changer. And just to add, my own regiment, the Royal Tank Regiment, sort of invented tank warfare. On the 20th of November 1917, tanks were used the first time and broke through the German lines, pushed them back 17 kilometres, the biggest advance in the First World War. The Russians are static, fighting like the First World War, which is why I think the Ukrainians should be delighted and excited the chance to have manoeuvre warfare to break through those lines, as long as they're supported by all the other elements of combined arms manoeuvre. This is going to be a pivotal time, but let's not underestimate and put things in the way for logistic support and training. I think we just need to enable the Ukrainians to get on with it and help them as much as we can.
Fascinating. This question, Sean, you take this one on as well. Will NATO's military technology be at risk if tanks are captured by Russian forces? Now, of course, both sides capture each other's vehicles. Is that, people are wondering, has that been part of the hesitancy, particularly by the United States with its super high-tech weapons? And does it apply also to, aircraft that Ukraine is asking for, the high-tech drones that they haven't supplied? Is that part of the reason why they're not being
Well, that's a great question that we'd have a bottle of wine and we could talk about that for ages. I think that the technology angle, the technology is the Western asymmetric advantage, and it's very rare for any nation to deploy its state-of-the-art technology. It's very unlikely the US would put its very latest technology in the hands of the Ukrainians on the battlefield like that. It's possible, but I think the question about the fighter jets is very different. I do take Hamish's point about the tank crews, if their experience can be quite quick. But training Ukrainian pilots to fly an F-16 or an F-15, that is not simple at all. Conversion courses in the military, in the Royal Air Force, would take 6 to 9 months to convert somebody, and that's with the benefits, and they would pop out at the end of that not being particularly competent at the range of technology that's available to them. So I think there is it's gradients. Give somebody a gun, it's pretty simple to use. Go to a tank, it's slightly more difficult. An aircraft, we're escalating yet another level of complexity.
And may I just interject there? And this is on the symbolism again. We've been talking about German tanks fighting Russians in Ukraine, but also given the way that President Putin is characterising this war within Russia itself and with their allies around the world, have the Americans been hesitant about allowing their tanks to be fighting Russian tanks in Europe?
Well, almost certainly, because practically speaking, the Kremlin is painting this as not about Ukraine. It's a battlefield for East versus West, about Russia facing an American-led NATO. And if America was just a wheel in, there's 9,000 of their tanks available in the world, they could relatively simply give 3% of those and meet Zelensky's aim.
300.
So to meet the 300. But almost certainly America wouldn't want to be seen at the forefront of providing this game-changing technology, because that just plays to the Kremlin's narrative. The reason Leopard 2 is so attractive is it's operated by 13 different countries. There's over 2,000 available. It's a very capable tank, and therefore other nations can spread the load. And Challenger 2 is very capable, as I'm sure Hamish would vouch for. But the numbers, it's only operated by herself and Oman. There just aren't the numbers to provide Ukraine with the numbers. And I don't think Ukraine would want to be operating lots of different types of tanks with different training requirements, different training support, different logistics support and different ammunition. So I think part of the reluctance for America was that political reluctance to be seen at the lead, but I suspect we're still well short of the 300 that Zelensky's asked for. But in the coming days and weeks, I wouldn't be at all surprised if we see those numbers eke up.
OK, well, we've got a question here, which I suppose is partly about the response from the Kremlin, from Russia. Elena Kamenko, the question is this: does providing tanks and further increases in Western aid, such as you were asking for, does it significantly raise the risk of World War III? We know the Kremlin are saying that this is another dangerous escalation.
The more capabilities, defense capabilities Ukraine has, the smaller the escalation potential Russia has. And for the long time, Kremlin tried to scare Europe, America, and the whole world with this escalation intrigue, and is as if Russia could do something particularly strong in response to helping Ukraine. But time has shown that this is, in a way, a bluff. And from the first day of full-scale war, Russia acts as a terrorist against Ukraine and the world. And Ukrainian cities have already been burned by occupiers. Ukrainians have been brutally killed and raped and being deported to Russia. And everything that Russia could destabilize in the world, it has already did. Therefore, now it is necessary to defeat Russian aggression and do it as soon as possible. So we shouldn't fear, and we shouldn't be scared of this bluffing and this threats.
And hey, Mr. Breton-Gordon, continuing with that theme, this question, given the escalation of now supplying Ukraine with modern Western tanks, what is next? And we heard from Elena there, obviously aircraft. Is that a possibility?
Well, I don't know about that. Sean's probably better answered there. But what is critical is that when the armour goes forward, and I agree with President Zelensky, 300, an armoured division is really what he needs to be able to have a significant impact in both the Crimea and the Donbass. But critical is that these armoured forces are supported with infantry, with artillery, the HIMARS, ideally with air as well. Air power is critical, but again, it doesn't appear that the Russians have air superiority. So talk coming out of Moscow that their ground attack aircraft and helicopters are going to take these tanks out, you know, I just don't get it. We haven't seen them really having a great effect thus far. Of course, sophisticated modern Western aircraft would help. But as Sean said, you know, that could be many, many months away. I think the fact that we can get armoured forces onto the ground relatively quickly, that will have the impact. Because, again, I don't think Russia, talking about escalation, I don't really see where they're going to go. They're sort of running out of most things. And I come from the group who believe that actually Putin's tactical nuclear weapons are unusable for a whole variety of reasons. So I think
can I just interject there? Hamish, given your expertise, what about something like a chemical or biological attack?
Well, again, I think this is, you know, Putin's threatened sort of these false flag attacks with biological and chemical. Again, I think this is bluffing. I can't see how they would have an impact. You know, you talk about Novichok and stuff like that. That's very point sort of capability. The nuclear side, again, I think these weapons are unusable. It would take Russia too much time to move them into an area where they could affect Ukraine. And I'm sure NATO and the West would be able to prevent them actually being fired. So escalation, we hear about hypersonic missiles and all the rest of it, these multi-billion-dollar missiles being fired to take tanks out again. It's just not realistic. But I think the armoured warfare has the key to unlock things. But it's quite ironic, of course, you know, our own military has been denuded because we all thought the next war would be fought in space and in cyberspace. Now it would appear that things are a little bit more like the status quo ante as they were before. So I think the key is timing. If we can get sufficient combat power to the Ukrainians, get them trained up, then I think they have the opportunity in this sort of spring offensive or early summer to unlock the Russians, unhinge them, get behind them with this rapid mobile warfare. Because the other thing about tanks, you know, you can move several hundred miles in a day. They have 50-odd rounds of ammunition, potential to take out 50 Russian tanks, each single tank. And as we've heard, they've got the protection to do it. So this is, you know, a real opportunity here. And I'd like, well, I hope that Ukraine's enabled to get on with it. We don't want to be prevaricating just to get extra, you know, aircraft or whatever. So I think the chemical, biological and nuclear is a complete sort of dispersion at the moment. And we shouldn't pay too much haste to it.
I just want to bring in Sean on that. And a very interesting word you used there about prevaricating, because some people are also asking, yes, what is next? But, you know, why not? Now, look at these tanks. If this announcement had been made a year ago, it would be a very different battlefield we're looking at now. If the West, if NATO is going to get involved, well, then get involved. Stop arguing about it. Give the Ukrainians what they want and what they need.
I think the history books will be written about this whole conflict, and it was a real test of how far do you lean. In the early days of this conflict, defensive weapons were pretty freely handed to Ukraine and had a decisive impact. You remember the 40-mile convoy outside Kyiv and, of course, the devastating effects on the armour. Now that Ukraine has so bravely fought the back, I mean, Russia's given up over 50% of the territory that it had taken. The challenge now is Ukraine. I think it's a really inflection point. It's exactly as Hamish said, but it's not just about tanks. It's about the West suddenly going from a defensive posture of support to actually how do we now enable Ukraine to push Russia out?
So in that sense, it is a turning point.
It's an inflection point, undoubtedly. The challenge is how do these weapons actually get used most effectively? And I agree with Hamish. I think if you look at the options for Russia now, largely their military looks as if it's culminated. It doesn't look as if it's got anywhere to go. They can mobilise more people, but they're not going to quickly get the weapons and the equipment. They're mobilising their industry, but that takes years, not days, to solve the problem. So it'll be really interesting over time, which generally speaking, Russia will be looking in the long term here. The challenge is, has the West got the appetite for the long term? And how do we make these decisions slightly quicker and give Ukraine the tools it needs to prevail?
OK, got another quick question I notice here on tanks, and we don't seem to have mentioned this. Hamish, do you know? It's about France. Theirs is the Leclerc, isn't it? Is there now pressure on France to follow suit and send its tanks to Ukraine?
Well, I certainly think there's pressure on France to send tanks. Leclerc is yet another type of tank, again, hugely capable, similar sort of firepower, manoeuvre and mobility to the Challengers, the Abrahams, and also the Leopard tanks. Whether that would complicate things more, one would hope perhaps actually it's masses of Leopard 2s, which, as you said earlier on, there are thousands in Europe that are available to be used. So I think morally we want to hear the French strongly shout for main battle tanks for the Ukrainians. Whether Leclerc would, I mean, it would add a hell of a punch, but would add more complexity as well. So I think the key is in numbers. If we can get up to 300 main battle tanks, I expect they'll mainly be Leopards for Ukraine. That will be decisive. That will allow the Ukraine to have the impact that we're all hoping for. Moral support from the French. Leclerc's would help, but might complicate things as well.
OK, well, plenty of questions, as we've already had, about where this is all leading. And this really is a big picture question about a potential peace deal, or how does it all end? And Elena Kamenko, can I put this to you? The question is, will any peace deal between Kyiv and Moscow result in Russia keeping control of Crimea? How far is Ukraine prepared to go to achieve peace?
If you ask any Ukrainian today if he or she agrees that we would lose some of our territories, and Crimea is considered by all Ukrainians as Ukrainian territory. If you ask them, they would definitely, everyone would answer that they don't agree to have peace on under these conditions. So we are not ready to agree on such kind of conditions.
And Sean Bell, that's been a consistent line from Ukraine. Crimea is our territory. You seized it in 2014. There's no peace talks, no peace deal until it is returned to Ukraine. And just in terms of returning it, recapturing it, do the tanks change the equation? Could we ultimately see a big tank-led battle to recapture Crimea?
Yeah, there's a couple of questions in there, one of which I think if the tanks are used to punch a hole between the sort of land bridge between Crimea and the Donbass, it certainly isolates Crimea and does create a real threat militarily to Crimea. I think from historical reasons, without going into the detail, Crimea would be militarily extremely difficult to take. But going to your wider point, loads of questions about what does winning look like in this conflict? And it's very difficult to see either side winning in the conventional sense, that both sides will pay a huge price. Ukrainian people, the population have paid a huge price. Left of arc is Russia sweeps through the whole of Ukraine. That looks really unlikely. Right of arc is that Russia is expelled out of every corner of the Donbass and the Crimea. Again, practically from a military perspective, looks really difficult. So the real challenge is, how does this conflict get brought to an end? And undoubtedly, President Zelensky and the Ukrainian politicians will have a huge weight of history resting on their shoulders. It's certainly not the right time now, but at some stage, this war will have to end, and there will have to be some sort of very difficult conversations to enable that to happen.
Well, our next question follows on from that. And Hamish de Breton-Gordon, in your honest opinion, how many years do you see the conflict in Ukraine lasting for? Well, you mentioned the tank parallel with the First World War. 4 years?
Well, I think it's impossible to say. I mean, going back to the previous discussion, one thing I suppose one has to think about, what is the vital ground? And vital ground militarily is ground that is essential to your mission. And if you lose it, your mission fails. And, you know, is Crimea vital ground for both Ukraine and for Russia? But as far as the longevity, I think nobody except the Russians want it to go any longer than it needs to be, which is why it's so vital that the West give absolutely everything they can to ensure that Ukraine prevails. We have prevented Ukraine from losing. Now we must enable them to win. What winning looks like, I think only the Ukraine people can tell us. And whether that is, as Sean says, the right of art with Ukraine retaking Crimea and the whole of the Donbass, going back to the boundaries of 2014, only Ukraine can answer that. But I think what is key is this show of unity from the West, this show of this heavy armour going into Ukraine. I'm sure Putin and his other people around in the Kremlin will realise that their time, things are numbered now, and they have got to start thinking seriously of what they go next. I don't think they can escalate much. They either lose everything or they start coming to the negotiation table. But it doesn't seem ripe at the moment. And in my view, it's entirely up to the Ukraine people to decide what they will negotiate over, if anything. But I think that's why this tank announcement today is so key, because it very much tips the balance in favour of Ukraine. And I'm sure the Ukraine people don't want this war to go on any longer than possible, certainly not for another few years.
Well, let's hear that from the elected representative of the Ukrainian people who's here with us tonight, Elena Kamenko. And on that question about how long the war will last. Presumably, the Ukrainian people respond as long as it takes.
Sorry.
I apologise. I'm just wondering.
I have some.
You heard the question there.
I have some technical problems.
Okay.
Sorry,
The question is.
Please.
The question is. Just let me clarify. Just be clear with us and send a message here to all the UK viewers. The resolve, the iron resolve of the Ukrainian people to see off the Russians.
Ukrainians, they support the peace plan of Vladimir Zelensky, and this plan includes 10 steps, and until these 10 steps are fulfilled, we do not agree for any peace talks, or there is no peace without these conditions. So you know that it's about radiation and nuclear safety. It's about food security. It's energy security, and also we need to release all prisoners of war and return deported persons. Also, we need to establish a special tribunal and prosecute political and military leadership of Russia for the crime of aggression. And so until this is done, there will be no any agreements.
Hamish, might be time for our last question there, but thank you very much indeed for that, Elena Kamenko. Is America's timing, and indeed Germany and the UK's timing on this tank announcement, I'll add into this question, is it likely to push Russia closer to starting their next offensive, given what we've discussed about how long it is actually going to take to get these tanks into theatre? Could the Russians try to preempt that?
Well, I'm sure, timing is always absolutely crucial in military operations. But it is very clear from what we've seen of the Russian military that we have all been surprised how very poor they are. And of course, a lot of their elite troops and elite equipment is now destroyed. Reports of 3,000 or so Russian tanks destroying. Well, obviously, you can't verify that. But they have lost a lot of their frontline capability. They're having to rely on the mercenary criminals of the Wagner Group to be the sort of the spear point, if you like, of their efforts. So, I think Russia is in a really bad way militarily, and we haven't seen any evidence of Russian maneuver warfare. Sean mentioned that the assault on Kiev at the very beginning of this conflict. It was amateurism. It was almost pathetic, if that isn't the wrong word to use. So I don't think the Russians are in any position to mount any sort of armoured manoeuvre, armoured advance at the moment. They've certainly shown no capability for it. So I don't see that happening. I think the Ukrainians will be keeping up the pressure on those Russian forces. All they can do is throw conscripts into the front. And, some of the horrific stories we're hearing about in the Donbass, where, hundreds, if not thousands of these recruits who are given a rifle a day's training and told to go over the top in sort of First World War Passchendaele type activity, is just shocking, horrifically shocking. So, I don't think there is, they might well try and start some early offensive, but I don't see they've got the combat power or the capability or the knowledge to be able to execute that. So that is why it's so crucial that Ukraine gets its combat power together. We're led by this armour that is coming from Germany and elsewhere, enable them to hold off that spring offensive and then conduct their own offensive whenever that might be, hopefully, in the near future, to push the Russians back to enable the peace deal that of course, everybody ultimately wants sooner rather than later.